Hello and welcome to Perspectives. Today's guest is Oscar Camargo, who's running in the 14th Essex as a candidate against incumbent Diana DiZoglio. In the contest are two other candidates, Phil DeCalogero and Rosemary Smedley, who's running on the Republican ticket. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Dan.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you into politics? Have you been in politics for any length of time? Have you served in any other capacities?
Oh, okay. I could definitely answer that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a 14-year Army veteran. Been deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo.
Wow.
But even though I'm a first-time candidate, I'm no stranger to public service.
Okay.
Been in for 14 years and still counting as well, now with the Army Reserves. But what interested me in the whole idea of politics in general is just the idea of duty, about giving back to the community. Because in many ways, I've been very much blessed. I can go about my life history, but in the end, I feel as though I was so fortunate enough to receive so many opportunities throughout my life that in many ways I feel morally obliged to give back.
Wow. That's great. Yeah. So you said that you've been involved in public service for 14 years?
Yeah, 14 years. I can at least
Okay.
consider that.
Okay. Can you, is that including the military service?
Well, predominantly military service, but also
Okay.
I've been active in the community, whether it's VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, also the League of Women Voters, the Knights of Columbus, of that sort right there.
Okay. Okay. So how did you decide to join this race?
Well, in many ways, the events that somewhat occurred, the fact is the incumbent, Diana DiZoglio,
Yes.
she came into, when she became a state representative, she had a lot of lofty ideas that she wanted to advocate for, whether it's transparency or fighting for, lowering taxes down in the 14th district, throughout the Merrimack Valley. She reneged on several of those, and in many ways, I found myself with a bunch of my friends sitting down talking about how this could happen, why was this happening, and a friend of mine looked at me and said, "You know what? Why don't you put your money where your mouth is, and why don't you run? Stop complaining. Do something about it."
I love those kind of conversations. And so you rose to the challenge, did you?
Yes, I did, and I'll tell you this much: it's a difficult challenge.
How is it? In what way is it difficult?
Well, the best part about it is actually going door to door. I love that part. The hard part, though, is really, raising funds, going to events and so forth, networking. Not because I'm a stranger to it, it's just a little bit different. It's a different animal. Talking to voters is one thing, but, when you're talking to, groups of political insiders or of that sort right there, it becomes very, very muddled.
Right. Right.
And the thing is, I want to owe my allegiance not to political insiders, but I want to owe my allegiance to the voters, and that's why I'm focused on them.
Nice. Yeah, I would think that the fundraising could be pretty challenging.
Well, it's always hard to ask people for money.
It would be for me, definitely. Gosh, there's so many questions to ask. I sent out copies of the questions to all the candidates and the incumbent. Actually, she wasn't interested in the questions, so she never did receive a copy of the questions. But I was interested in the first question I had is kind of what are your theological or philosophical kind of basis for your beliefs around law? Like I looked to the Declaration of Independence, for instance, it talks about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I looked to the Bill of Rights, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, trial by jury, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I wondered kind of what informs your ideas about legislation, and what is it that you feel strongly about there?
Okay, well, that's a very fair question to ask. And for me, when it comes right down to it, I'm all about the rule of law.
Okay.
Because, I'm a big admirer of the Constitution itself and the amendments that go along with it as well. And I know later on we'll be having a little bit more in-depth discussion about that.
Okay.
But the rule of law is very important because constitutions are nothing more than just words. guidelines, a framework. But it's the rule of law, the enforcement of those rules, and creating that precedence that really gives the basis, the weight behind law. And really, in many ways, law is a reflection of a society, what they deem acceptable, what they don't deem acceptable. And in many ways, the Constitution, or even the Declaration of Independence, is a reflection of society, what they're willing to tolerate, what they're not willing to tolerate. And for me, the Constitution itself is a great guideline as to what the Founding Fathers envisioned for the future of the country, but also their hopes for it as well. I'm not a strict, I don't read the Constitution as it's written in stone. The only thing I ever read as written in stone, there's 10 of them, and I believe they're passed down by the divine. And even then, we have a hard enough time following those. But when it comes right down to the Constitution itself, I think about the thought process that came behind it, the ideas about state rights, the idea of say the 10th Amendment itself right there, the idea of federalism and what it means. And that for me is a huge driving force, because it builds our nation, our country, under the guidelines that we are a country of laws. Without laws, we're just a ship without a rudder.
Right. It comes to mind that law can be immoral.
Well, that's true, and in many ways,
There's been many laws that have been like in the Constitution. I think African American at the time who were slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person.
That is right.
And that was the law. And I think it's still. What was it, the 13th and 14th Amendments?
The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th established essentially, who can become a U.S. citizen.
So giving humanity to people of the African background.
Well, remember the fact that the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, so they were the first 10 corrections. So in many ways, the Constitution itself, like I said before, it wasn't written in stone. But even if you go back, say, to Andrew Jackson's presidency, when you have the issue of a nullification, whether or not states have the right to nullify federal law. This is something that's even happened in the 60s as well when it came to in the South in regards to segregation, or desegregation, I should say. So there's always been contentions between the federal government and the states on that right there. And that still exists. And really it's that give and take that goes along with that. But you're right. In the Constitution itself, there were, for example, the 3/5 counting as African Americans as 3/5. That was corrected. And in many ways, that's what the beauty of the Constitution is. It allows for amendments. It allows for us as a society to decide whether or not, at this time, at this moment, can we make adjustments? And that's what's made our Constitution very much one of the most successful ones in history.
Yeah. It seems that there should be some ethical principles that guide a person in government that precedes law, that undergirds law.
Well, for me personally, I'm a practicing Catholic.
Okay.
I believe, I'm a God-fearing man. And in many ways, sometimes I look about how things have happened in my life, and sometimes I fall in that simple idea that it was divine intervention, or that I've been blessed. And in many ways, I feel as though I have been blessed.
Good.
I'm happy to have a mother who cares for me, brothers that are loving and caring, friends who are more than willing to help out, friends who are practically like family.
Yes. Sometimes better.
Yeah. And it's those things right there that make me feel as though, okay, well, maybe there's a little bit more out there. And when it comes to my religious beliefs, they guide me, but they don't dictate, necessarily how I would act as a legislator. Because as a legislator, as state representative, you're acting on behalf of people, on behalf of your district, your constituents, and their beliefs may run contrary to yours.
Right.
But you make that balance. You try to find that balance between your personal, beliefs and principles versus that of what's best in the best interest of your constituents. And it's not an easy one. And I'm not naive enough to think that you're going to find the right perfect balance every single time. Sometimes you're going to make people upset by standing up for what you believe in. Sometimes people will be more than willing to cheer you on because you made in their opinion, the right choice.
Okay, so there's a spiritual dimension to your soul, really, to your heart, that guides you in terms of your thinking about law, and you're referencing Catholicism, and I would think that there's certain ethical teachings or moral teachings in Catholicism that would be could be in conflict, as you say, with other people's spirituality or other people's moral beliefs, what's right and what's wrong. And so you're saying that you're trying to keep those two things separate.
Well, say for example, capital punishment. For me,
Okay.
I'm against the notion of capital punishment.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It goes against my religious beliefs.
Okay.
And Massachusetts does have it on its books,
Okay.
but it hasn't been enforced.
Right.
So that right there is a very interesting little ethical dilemma that sometimes pops up in my mind as well.
Right.
Because
Right.
I made it quite clear that I am anti-capital punishment.
Okay.
But
Good.
I understand the fact that there's some people who feel as though then what is the nature of justice itself?
Right.
Is justice itself a form of retribution, or is it about rehabilitation?
Okay.
And that, like I said before, that balance right there, how do you find it? How do you rectify it?
Okay. Like the 3 strikes bill.
Well, even of that sort, or mandatory sentencing.
Exactly.
These are, because every single case is nuanced. Very few times are there situations where things are black and white. And if ever a black and white question ever did occur, you would be happy to have that, because either you're right or you're wrong. But often we find ourselves weighing in a gray scale. And things don't exist in a vacuum. Crime doesn't exist for the sole reason that it because it's crime. There are many reasons that go behind it. Socioeconomic, there's also political, philosophical reasons as to why it happens, sociological, cultural even. But, like I said before, I am not naive to think that, I have the solution to all these issues.
You
at all.
don't?
No, I don't. And I've always been a better listener than I've been a talker. So,
Okay.
which is, I know, rare for a politician to say, but I'm first to admit that I don't know everything. I'm more than willing to ask enough questions to hopefully get there.
Well, one of the foundations in the Declaration of Independence is liberty. Individual dignity, the dignity of the individual, and that flowing out of a spirituality. They mention a creator in the Declaration of Independence. That free will, or the ability to choose, is core to our humanity. And so, to me, legislation should flow from the dignity of the individual and their right to choose. And to me, there seems like there's many laws on the books that interfere with people's right to choose.
Well,
And I would wondering what your thoughts are about that, and how would you take that kind of legislation on?
well, that's a very good question right there. And I would state that the ability to choose is one of the most fundamental freedoms that we have. But just because we have the freedom to choose doesn't mean we don't exist in a vacuum. There are also consequences, positive and negative as well, to your choice.
Right.
Whether it's a woman's, a right to choose, whether or not to have an abortion, or the right to choose your own religious beliefs, or the right to choose to yell out fire in a crowded theater. There are consequences behind that, both personal and very much public as well.
Right.
And that's the role, in many ways, of a legislator,
Okay.
or someone who wants to, represent, the people. Because in the end, you're trying to find that balance. Because yes, people do have the right to choose, have the right to choose, but at what point does it become disruptive for the rest of society? Like I mentioned before, laws are in of themselves also a reflection of society, what they deem appropriate and what they deem inappropriate. And it's constantly changing over and over again. I mean, you look at the idea of, say, marriage equality here in Massachusetts. Think about 100 years ago, how that would have been far-fetched.
True.
And yet here we are right now, where it's become almost a norm,
True.
and it's sweeping across the nation.
True.
Our values change, and therefore our laws reflect that.
True. That's why I'm worried when you say, you know, we're a society by a rule of law as opposed to something more fundamental in terms of ethics that laws flow from. Because in our history, there's been a need for civil disobedience. The Ferguson situation, for instance, is an example of people exercising civil disobedience, but that, of course, it's gone wild, way beyond. I'm thinking perhaps what you're pointing to is the golden rule, that I have free will, but I can't impose my will on you. I have the freedom to choose for myself, and I have to respect your freedom to choose as well. And if mine oversteps yours, that's where the rule of law would come in.
In many ways, yes, you are correct.
You know.
And my understanding as well is that, you know, rights are neither conferred by or derived from the state. They're God-given. And that being the case, though, you know, it's the role of the government itself, or any kind of government, to ensure that those rights are secured. You know, it creates a sense of stability.
Right. And then when we get into that idea of God-given, we're really walking on very,
well, then again,
you know, because there's a lot of people's ideas about what God said and who God is, and
let me just
so what are those rights? You know,
let me just
we get into dangerous territory. But
these are my beliefs, right here. And of course, I would be remiss if I put my words into anyone else's mouth.
Well, the First Amendment, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of whatever political
speech,
position.
Press.
Yes, exactly. So those kinds of principles, those kinds of ethical principles, to me, guide the rule of law.
And they're always tested as well.
Yes.
I mean, you think about the earliest defense of the freedom of speech, or even the freedom of press. I mean, look at John Adams' presidency, and the Alien Sedition Act. My goodness, very controversial. You know, if
viewers may not know.
Oh, the Alien Sedition Act itself, right there, was passed by the Adams administration, or at least pushed forward by the Adams administration, in order to prevent, say, foreigners from corrupting or bribing, exercising influence on U.S. citizens.
Okay.
This came from the XYZ affair, where French ambassadors or diplomats came by and tried to bribe American government officials to do, you know, their bidding.
Okay.
And of course, the Sedition Act is, you know, anything that's said that goes against the that would be used against the government. Any words or anything salacious. In fact, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was a congressman who essentially said that, you know, John Adams is not exactly a very good, you know, president. It was something of that line right there. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he was imprisoned. And to show you how popular...
For saying that?
Essentially, yes. And he was in prison. But this is how unpopular this entire thing was. It was so unpopular that he won re-election while he was in prison. Yeah.
Who was in prison?
John Adams.
Oh, he was in prison for saying...
No, not John Adams. A gentleman who essentially said John Adams, and while he was serving as president, wasn't...
a good president.
Yeah, essentially, it's along those lines right there.
And who was released, you said?
The gentleman who made that statement. He was a congressman.
And he was in prison for saying that?
Yes, under the Seditions Act.
Wow.
But my point being, right down to the basic part of it, is that there's always a balance about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, of that sort right there.
Right.
And usually what we tend to find, especially here in the States, is that, well, we always tend to find ourselves right back to true north.
Which means, true north means what?
That we still value the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press itself. These are fundamental rights that, you know, you talk to anyone, they would think to themselves, well, it makes sense. It's a norm.
Okay.
We've made it the norm.
Are there laws that impede people's individual freedom?
Well, there are many laws that actually do that, and far too many to enumerate. But one of them, I guess, would be, at least at the federal level, you would almost think about it as the most obvious one. It's the Electoral College.
Oh, okay.
Well, think about it this way. Your vote, what does it represent? It's your decision, it's your will, your individual choice to go for this person or that person. But at the federal level, it doesn't really belong to you. It goes to 500 plus, folk who just decide whether or not they should listen to your suggestion.
Okay.
Now, the whole reason behind that, though, is rather hilarious in of itself right there. I mean, the founding fathers thought to themselves that, too much tyranny would be a bad thing, obviously, but too much democracy in of itself right there would, would lead to, just chaos itself. So they tried to strike a balance, hence the Electoral College.
Well, as I understand it, I don't know if it's Article 2, Section 2, that the electors are described and what their role was. And as I understood, the constitutional debate around having electors was that the populace was considered too easily influenced, and that it would be better, like, say, the press. For instance, today, the press is, all the mainstream media is owned by 6 corporations. So whatever the press puts out there on TV or that becomes people's source of information. So it's very easy to control people's thinking and the information that they give through the mainstream media. That's why I like cable TV, because this is a real free speech zone. There's no editorial except my own. The station is not editorializing my programs. So, and anybody can come on cable TV and give their opinion. And so it really becomes an opportunity for us to critique the government or critique the candidacies or to raise any question that might be edited out in the mainstream media. And I think the idea was to have electors that were elected by popular vote that would then elect the president. And it was the same with the 10th Amendment, that we would have, that the people in the state legislature would elect the senator. And it was repealed in the 17th Amendment, and so it became popular vote, one person, one vote. Well, one man at the time, one vote. But to me, it seems very easy to influence people's thinking through the mainstream media, and there was a wisdom in the Constitution that set up electors. There was no electoral college, and there were electors. And it wasn't a winner-take-all in the Constitution. It was, each elector had their own vote.
No, I understand that, Dan. And, in many ways, the Founding Fathers tried to create a system where, it was, the politics itself was not adversarial. But obviously they failed, because politics is inherently adversarial.
Hopefully.
But doesn't mean that you can't be civil.
Right.
But also at the same time, though, times have changed, and yes, you brought up a very good point that say major corporations are able to own certain levels of media, but at the same time, though, you can't take into account, say, local newspapers. You can't take into account, say, also the internet, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, all these things where individuals are empowered. I mean, you talked about Ferguson. In many ways, Twitter right there is one of the reasons why it became such a big now international news story. It's individuals like you and I using the power of social media to our advantage.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting. We can take this one apart for sure.
Well, the nature of the questions that you have right there, I was hoping that we would go that far.
Yeah, we are getting close to a wrap up
really?
in our discussion. I know. I feel like we could go on and on and on, and I hope that you'll consider coming back.
I'd love to.
I'd like to, speaking of corporations and the role that corporations, if you could just take a minute or two, to talk about the role of corporations in our civil society, in our government, in our legislation, and what is your position on how they affect human free will?
Well, the idea of the corporation, or just the companies in general, it's not a new thing. I mean, you go back into history, you could see the earliest versions of individuals going together and then creating some kind of joint venture. In essence, the basis of a corporation. But do I think now, and take for example, I'm assuming you're alluding towards Citizens United, where the Supreme Court, deemed it essentially that a corporation does have the same rights as that of a person.
Well, yeah, in 1886, in the Supreme Court ruling, they said that corporations are persons.
But for I guess U.S. For U.S. law, it seems to be that's the rule of the land, and I would disagree. I would disagree in a sense because, it's sort of like a mockery of what it means to be a person.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people would say, well, the Supreme Court ruled it to be that way. Well, the Supreme Court in the past has made really, really bad decisions.
Yes, they have.
And they've been, and in time, they have also made those corrections as well.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. But by and large, they have. And I would say, and I would contend as well, that, should a piece of legislation come across me if I'm elected, and, contend essentially that to consider this idea a fallacy, I'd be the first one that's one to write it, sponsor it, push it forward, because it is. It's a mockery of you, it's a mockery of me, it's a mockery to the entire system itself that we can do that.
Well, you opened up with the whole issue of fundraising, and I think about the last election, presidential election, it was $3 billion. $3 billion to elect a president. Now, if we went back to the idea of electors, there would be no fundraising going on here, because electors who had been elected by the people, who were delegates to elect the president, there wouldn't be all of this, there wouldn't...
Well, I disagree, because we still have the Electoral College. We still have to get electors.
Well, it's a winner-take-all now.
Well, the system of two parties, yes, makes it that way. But, for example, I think it might be, I'm not sure exactly whether it might be Wyoming or I forget which state, but essentially they divide their electoral votes to
they do?
By percentage. So, for example,
that's good.
I'm not sure which state does this. I had it right on top of my head beforehand, but they do divide that up. That's a fair way of doing so, rather than the winner-takes-all approach.
I just think that we're in our last minute here, but that the corporations have a lot of money and have a huge effect on government. That
I agree
I think
with you
it was
on that.
$3 billion that was spent just on lobbying.
But I would also make a point as well that despite the fact that corporations do have this vested right, we can't exactly say that every single corporation is the worst thing ever.
Oh no. We're going to have
there's
to.
more nuanced.
We're going to have to come back and talk about this. Yes, we are. Well, thank you so much, and good luck.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on Perspectives, and I'm glad to introduce Oscar Camargo and his candidacy for the 14th Essex.